Now, if we didn't already know Energy Minister Chris Bowen was living on another planet, he did a pretty good job of confirming it today. Here he was, Casanova Bowen or Blackout Bowen or whatever you want to call him, at a press conference this morning to discuss climate change and 2035 emissions targets.
This is an opposition which is not committed to real action on climate, which denies the science and denies action. They are a coalition of climate inactivists and cookers, and they would cook the planet with their lack of a climate change policy.
They're going to cook the planet? My goodness, who would have thought the power of the opposition of Australia could be so great that they could single-handedly cook the planet with 1% of global emissions that we produce? The power of Peter Dutton knows no bounds, it seems. I mean, at least the government admits he can actually achieve something unlike them. But you might have also noticed that he referred to the opposition there as being full of cookers. Now, he wasn't just referring to cooking the planet, amusing as that is, and he wasn't referring to them being stovetops. Cooker is a term that has become popular on social media in the last year or two to describe conspiracy theorists. It means you're cooked in the head, tinfoil hat, a cooker. Now, most of you at home probably wouldn't have known that. You wouldn't have known what he meant, and nor would most of the population, except for unemployed or unemployable lefties who sit around all day complaining on Twitter, or X as it's now called. And that's who Bowen is talking to. He's not talking to the average Australian, because the average Australian couldn't really give two hoots about meeting emissions targets or whether we have one or not. They're worried about three things: cost of living, and cost of living. And those emissions targets contribute to that cost of living. Higher power bills, more expensive cars. No one's running around in the street, except for those aforementioned unemployable types, complaining that we're not doing enough about climate change right now. Bowen's priorities and the priorities of the federal government are warped towards people who'd never vote for the coalition anyway. Now, this outburst was triggered by a report in The Australian today that most Liberal MPs are privately opposed to them taking a 2035 emission reduction target to the next federal election because they're worried it would worsen the cost of living. And it's pretty clear that they're right. This was Nationals leader David Littleproud today.
I think it'll be difficult for us to put, in all honesty, a target on 2035, and that's demonstrated by the fact that we want to shift the energy debate about removing the ban on nuclear energy.
And of course it's difficult to put a target on 2035. There's no way to meet any of these targets. But Bowen has promised that the government will reveal a 2035 target before the next election, and this is how he assessed Peter Dutton today.
I previously said that Peter Dutton would be a worse Prime Minister for the climate than Scott Morrison. I now say, given that they are hinting they won't have a 2035 target and will leave the Paris Accord, he'll be a worse Prime Minister for the climate than Scott Morrison or Tony Abbott, and that takes some doing.
I mean, seriously, do you know how many times Bowen said cost of living during that press conference? Not once. Doesn't matter whether you can afford to live in this country or not. More important to somehow try to reduce the Earth's temperature from a nation of 26 million people. You may well feel that warmth a bit more if you can't afford to turn the air conditioner on. When these targets are not worth the paper they're written on, we simply won't meet them. The government claimed in November that we would reduce emissions by 42% by 2030, which is just below the 43% target. But a big part of meeting that target is an uptake in electric car sales, which Labor claimed would be 89% of all new sales by 2030. But the latest data from the Federal Transport Department shows it will actually be more like 27%. It's a hell of a discrepancy. AGL Director Kerry Schott, and she's a very experienced person in the energy sector, said last year that reaching the 2030 renewable energy target of 82% was a big challenge, and we're probably running late, quote unquote. It won't happen. That's despite AGL Chief Executive Damien Nicks saying the energy giant is going as fast as we can, quote unquote, to reduce emissions. Clearly they can't go fast enough to meet our destructive targets. Former Snowy Hydro boss Paul Broad in July, quote, said, "It's not just looking impossible, it is impossible. It cannot be done. We are blindly charging on simply because of political ideology. It's too much about the narrative, not about the reality of what needs to be done on the ground. Origin boss Frank Calabria says the transition to renewable energy is Herculean. Another senior energy executive who didn't want to be named told the AFR in July, quote, "Everybody believes the 2030 target will be missed, but nobody wants to say it because of what might happen. People are too frightened of some kind of retribution." No one who has knowledge of the energy sector seriously believes we can meet the 2030 target. Many of them are afraid to speak out because they're worried about what the government will do when they're embarrassed. And so here we are, carrying on as normal, power bills going up, in the pursuit of something we simply cannot achieve. The coalition would be mad to go to an election with a 2035 target because it would be just as unachievable and just as destructive, and it's as far from the minds of voters as you can get. But Bowen can keep talking into the ether to his Twitter crowd and hoping for the best. It'd be funnier if we weren't all paying for it. And speaking of paying for it, take a look at the Prime Minister on the ABC this morning, being asked whether he will deliver the Stage 3 tax cuts due in July.
Can you promise to those Australian families the Stage 3 tax cuts will come into effect in July in full?
Well, we haven't changed our position on that, Michael. I know that there's ongoing debate about the impact of those tax cuts, but we support reducing tax, and we've said that, and that's why, as well, we've been able to produce a budget surplus. We've factored that into the forward projections in the budget as well.
I'll ask that question again. Can you promise, as you did before the election, the Stage 3 tax cuts will come in full in July?
Well, I've said we haven't changed our position.
But can you promise, Prime Minister?
Well, I've said I can't be clearer than that. We haven't changed our position.
That's not exactly a promise, PM. It was a promise before the election. Has that promise changed?
Yeah, you can play word games, Michael. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. The government has exactly the same position.
Michael Rowland wasn't the one playing word games, Prime Minister. You were. And you can say the position hasn't changed. That doesn't mean it won't change at a later date. How hard is it to say, yes, I reaffirm my promise that we'll deliver Stage 3 tax cuts? Or more to the point, why couldn't he just say those words?